Hey there, it's Ryan. Welcome to today's fall painting lesson. We are going to be working on this misty scene right here. And before we begin, I will run you through our materials. I will be personally working with pigments from Winsor & Newton. With that, I will also be working with my brush set. It is a 5-piece brush set, and I use it for all the lessons here on the channel. With that, I will be working on an 8x10 inch canvas. I have a small dish of water and some paper towel to wipe off all of my excess water and pigment. Now, if you're looking at the image and you're thinking, oh no, I'm not great at drawing, don't worry, I also have the traceable up over on Patreon, so you will get the perspective, the sizing, the details, all of that just right. And up there you can also get things like the reference photos, bonus lessons, we do art critiques, and you can also get my ebooks, which include acrylics for beginners. So if you're interested, check it out, but those are the materials and we are about to get started. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and I will dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will just help keep our paint wet for a little bit longer. From there, we'll grab an abundance of titanium white, a hint of Mars black, and a hint of cerulean blue. This is to render a fairly desaturated bright blue, which we'll begin to apply. And I'm not always bringing this all the way down. We essentially have this line of foliage in the distance, which I'm working down to. Just making sure we have a nice thick application towards the top. Again, working around some trees, but not others. And I'm using the nice sharp edge of this larger flat-headed brush to help me cut along the edges. Now, while it currently looks quite bright, need not worry, it is a misty scene. We're going to have a lot of light coming through the mist, and as a result, we're going to have somewhat of a brighter opening towards the back. There we go. Now we'll move down a little bit, and as we do move down, we'll make our pigment slightly more blue and slightly darker. The Mars black and the titanium white are going to desaturate each other, and the blue, so we need to add an excess of blue to allow that saturation to continue to live on in the mix here. But from there, we're going to continue that application in between our trees, right under the previous pigments. And as you can see, I'm not actually blending it in to that top blue just yet. I want to apply quite a bit of it because I don't want to essentially do that blend here and then take that mixed pigment and then move that down into the bottom in this section. So we're just trying to make sure that our pigment stays relatively clean. And now that I've worked my way across, using a little bit of a tapping motion, we're going to get a somewhat blended transition as the pigment on top is still somewhat wet. If it's not wet, that's okay. This will look quite nice even if it's just a dry transition, and it'll also look quite nice if it's a wet transition. There we go. Now we'll continue moving downwards, and as we do, we will remix that pigment we were just working with. However, yet again, we are going slightly darker, slightly more blue, and for the first time, we'll also interject a hint of our sap green. This will just transition us more into the middle ground. We're currently very much painting the background, but with each layer, we move slightly closer to us, we get more towards the innate color of subjects rather than all of the reflected cool blues that exist in the background. And again, we're using this great flat-headed brush to work in between all of our details, whether that be the individual trees or our foreground. And before we get too far, I am going to start that transition. Sometimes I'm just using the corner of the brush. For the most part, these are going to exist towards the left-hand side, and it'll progressively get lower as we move towards the right. But you can see how this is building layers of dimension. And as I really run out of pigment, then I can go back over these spots, build them up higher in a less dramatic way. I have almost no pigment left on my brush, though what is there is now a combination of the blue and the greens, so I'm bringing the blues back down to integrate those hues and that texture below as well. Here we'll take a step back just to ensure that we're looking at the painting as a whole rather than getting too close and detail oriented. That is a pitfall I think we all run into here and there. We end up making one area look incredibly detailed and brilliant, but it doesn't really fit with the rest of the painting, and then we have to go over it and change it despite really loving what we've rendered. So here we're just trying to take that step back and ensure that we don't have to go through that process. Giving ourselves that wider perspective really does help. Yet again, I'm working in between all the little pieces of our foreground. Still just using the same brush for this painting. Trying to apply thick layers. And occasionally going over my drawings because we can always just redraw them in after. It's not a big deal. Now I am going to head back and we'll do that same tapping feature that we did over here on the left hand side, except we'll start moving it into the center and over to the right. And I am beginning by just doing a little bit, giving it a slight extension upwards, giving it a minor amount of texture, and then as I start to run out of pigment, then I can run back towards the beginning and get this even softer application, which you can see I am now working even farther over to the left, because realistically this added texture, these additional layers are just going to build it up in a great way. So now we have 3 layers of depth essentially. We have the opening back, we have the softer blue, and now we have the bluish green. Now, for this next step, it's imperative that everything we have here is fully dry. We have a clean brush and clean water. We're going to remix the pigment that we used initially for the very top. So a lot of titanium white, hint of Mars black, hint of cerulean blue. We're mixing it very thoroughly so that we don't have some parts that are more blue or black. And then we're going to grab a lot of extra water and mix that on our palette to the point where our pigment becomes like that of watercolor. We want it incredibly thin. So we can take it, apply it to the top, Then in horizontal strokes, we work our way down. And as you can already see, it's making that darkish blue-green much more cohesive, a lot brighter. And we let it run out as we work our way towards the bottom so that the top area is brighter and then it progressively gets darker. This will give it a nice misty look. And there we go. So we're not done. We can do this multiple times. And I always start at the top because I want a good transition through all of it. See that? Slow and surely, we build those layers. Now, before we start adding grass through here and whatnot, we do need to paint in the actual ground, and I'm going to do so with an abundance of raw umber, Mars black, and titanium white. Initially, we're going for a fairly desaturated dark raw umber, just like so. And so just glide across the canvas. We'll use that nice sharp edge to craft our way around the boards of the bridge. And we'll have it overlapping where a lot of our greenery is, because we want to overlap the greenery on top of this. We'll also take it and we'll move this into the background. While this brush is great for detail work, I do think I'm going to switch brushes on over to the smaller flathead brush to do the remainder of the details in between all of our nice wooden structures here. Again, overlapping portions of this, that's okay. From here, we'll wait till it's starting to dry. Still want it a little bit wet for blending purposes, but I don't want it wildly wet because I don't want it to take over our next mixture. And with that, we are going to grab a lot of our burnt umber, a little bit of the Mars black, so I can just take that from our last mix, and this time an abundance of titanium white. You can see just how quickly that brightens up, and we're working a lot of that that raw umber back in to reinstigate saturation. Now, I'm going to apply this initially, as you can see, in the middle section. And this middle area is going to receive the most light because the areas on the edges are going to have shadows from the foliage which we are yet to paint. So I apply this and then I just let it softly blend into both sides. You can see a lot of brush strokes in here, that's okay. I'm going to move back to the smaller flat-headed brush, and I'm going to do a series of taps both in and out of the darker edges to bring the highlights outwards and the darker portions inwards. It's going to create a nice texture, make it look like portions of the ground are raised and there are divots. This is going to imply that light is hitting pieces of it but not all of it. And it's just a really quick, easy way to build a lot of unique detail. Again, both pigments are still wet to a point, so it really isn't difficult to do the blends, especially with a damp brush. And here you can see from a bit of a closer angle I'm still just working my way over the side to the point where we have this textural tap all the way throughout. Now we can take that, work it up into the top area as well. Again, predominantly keeping it in the middle for the initial points, and then we'll move into the taps towards the edges, recognizing that there's a lot less detail in the background here because it is the background. We're just not going to see that much detail from afar, so you don't have to worry about that too much. Stepping back, I like the textures and the movements, though we definitely still need to work on brightening it significantly. I'll add some titanium white to our mix, I'll add some raw umber to our mix. Pick up that same smaller flat-headed brush, head towards the center, and I'll go back in with those same taps that we did before, letting them work their way out. It's worth noting the pigment on the canvas is still wet. So this is not wet into dry, it is wet into wet. However, wet into dry will also work nicely as you build extra texture. Here I'm getting softer blends instead. And with the ground, honestly you can go either way, because there are going to be a lot of those textures, and the granular texture of the canvas can be great for implying that. You can see I'm working pretty quickly and sporadically. That's intentional. I want to create a lot of randomization. And as we get towards the edges, it really dissipates, it gets a lot darker. Once we have a good amount of this on here, we can also switch our brush. And I'll do that in just a second. On over to our fan brush, and as you can see, this is essentially 100 little bristles, each great for making individual details and markings. So pick up some pigment, some of the brighter pigment, and then towards the center, I'll start tapping that on. We'll work it towards the outskirts. We'll work the outskirts inside. This is taking away some of the more dramatic mark making that the flat-headed brushes did, and incorporating much smaller details and textures that we just couldn't render with that other brush, because this is essentially pressing details with individual bristles, right? Where in the past, we were always working with a collection of bristles. So this just opens up our doors and opportunities in a way that the other brushes simply can't. I'm also working some of this into the background. And I'm doing a bit more of a tight tap to this to make larger areas and clusters. Because again, we just want to see the detail to the same extent back there. Now we can get up nice and close, switch over to a liner brush. Great for very intentional detail work. We can't make markings as small as the fan brush, but we can make very small intentional markings. Going to build up an even brighter variant of that which we had. And with this, we can just start painting in little sticks or twigs. Sometimes they separate, sometimes they're together. And this is just going to add a little bit of realism, right? We don't need dramatic markings here. We just need the implication of that which we know would be on the ground. We can also go with a darker mixture, even grabbing from what we used on the edges. And we can create the bottom of the sticks with that, or even a shadow right under them. It's getting quite dark. Should probably brighten up the camera. Now we're going to take a bit of a step back and we'll grab some of our cerulean blue, an abundance of titanium white, hint of Mars black, and we're essentially remixing the pigment that we use up here or something akin to it. It can be slightly darker, it can be slightly more blue, but we do want something relatively bright. From there, I'm going to switch to the liner brush. Great for detail, and that's what we want right now. We'll grab this, and we'll start working in some trees, which will slowly lose as we move down in the painting. And you can see that I'm making these predominantly with multiple strokes. Because when we make them with an individual elongated stroke, they often look a little too perfect. And trees should be a bit more unique. So we're working our pigment down. Just like so. Now I know at this point it does look a little messy, don't worry about it. We are going to get it a lot more clean, but for now we are just going to continue building those distant layers. Here you can see I'm making a much darker mixture. Still not that dark in comparison to that which we have at the bottom, but it's definitely moving in that direction. And here you can see it's quite noticeable at the top, which is nice. Starting to add some detail up there, which previously we just didn't have. And you can go over trees that you made before with the last mixture, or you can make new ones. But I'm going to try to diversify quite a bit. And much like the last trees, I'm making this with an abundance of strokes. Trying to make them different distances from each other. There's a real effort in that. We don't want them all right beside each other. We don't want them all looking like mirrors of clusters to the side. We could do this with a larger flat-headed brush quite quickly, but I do like the added control of our liner brush. Here we are. Now, yet again, even darker, mixing up significantly more pigment. While we're not making a lot of markings here, we're definitely working through a good amount of paint because they are quite elongated. This should be quite stark. We work our way down, and as we do, our markings get larger because the tree itself will expand towards the bottom. And as you can see, it just gets lost in that bottom portion. By the way, you may notice that the background as a whole looks a little bit different from when we painted it. That's because I did an area down here and I really didn't like it. I thought we could do a lot better of a job, so I had to repaint the entirety of the background, which I don't think is really a bad thing in general. I think that's one of those things where, yes, it's time consuming, but you end up learning a lot. Often you like that second application more than the first, so it means a better painting. And speaks to just how malleable acrylics are as a whole. Here I'm just applying a little bit of that darker pigment to the inside of these trees. Just going to make it a bit more three-dimensional. Occasionally having them do a little bit of a crisscross. Speaking of which, I definitely need one through here because all of them are kind of leaning in this direction and we need to change that. There we go. Now we'll take that step back, and something I just tried was 2 branches on the sides, and I liked that a lot. So we're going to continue. I'm going to take my pinky finger, put it on the canvas, and that's just going to ground it so that I don't have a lot of shake in my hand. And then I'll create a couple branches which cross over other branches, and they'll get smaller as they extend outwards. Using a fairly damp brush so that we have a semi-opaque marking, and that also helps because it just lets the branches, for the most part, just blend into that misty backdrop. And I don't have any particular places that I'm really intentionally placing these. I'm just looking for areas that are open, like this, areas that look a little bland, or areas where the trees look too similar and I need a way of visually making them a bit more unique. Here, this area doesn't have a lot going on in terms of branches, so I'm just going to have this one wrap its way around. And we can have one up here. I'm double downing on the applications that are closer to the tree to make them slightly more opaque. And then as we get farther away, the branches get less and less opaque. There we go. You can see how so quickly we have an abundance of detail in our painting. We didn't really have to do much to get here, but just a couple minutes ago it looked fairly awkward, and now we have something that's really come together. So I like this so far. Next step is we're actually going to let all of this dry, and then we'll do a glaze. As you can likely tell, while it's all dry, the added layers and trees have made this look a lot darker as a whole, and we want to brighten it up just a bit, so I'm going to grab some titanium white, hint of our cerulean blue, and then I'm going to make it very watery. So an abundance of that. Then I'm going to head up to the top of my canvas, and with horizontal strokes I'm going to work this very thin layer of brighter pigment down the canvas. And we can slowly, and I do mean slowly, expand upon this, build up that brightness from the top, And we want it to dissipate as you move down, because we want the top of the trees to get lost in the light. And all of the reflected light. But this bottom area still does get an effect. There is an impact. It's not dramatic, but it's certainly present. Now eventually we're going to build up so much water that we're not really going to be able to apply new pigment that really sticks, so essentially just start ripping it off as we continue to apply layers. So it is important that after a certain point we do let the painting dry, and then we can come back and do this again. It's a lot like working in layers. It's definitely brightening it though. Now, once we have it as bright as we'd like, we are going to head back to our palette, grab a bit of Mars Black, about an equal amount of Titanium White, equal amount of our raw Umber, and then an equal amount of our Cerulean Blue. And this here should render a nice dark earthy blue, which we can then use, even with this brush, to craft some trees for the foreground. As we can see, they're cohesive with the ones in the background, but it's much more prominent, stark. We are working our way over past trees. Some of these are going to be smaller, some of them are going to be larger. We do still want to put a real effort into diversifying a lot of these. Trying to do this with multiple strokes to make it move in a unique fashion. Trying to make them get smaller as we move upwards. This is going to overlap portions of our bridge. That's okay. When we start at the top, we can go in with a very subtle application, very little pressure. And then as we progressively work downwards, we can apply more and more pressure to expand the bristles, the size of them, make a larger marking, and therefore a larger tree. Just like that. Now I am starting to run out of pigment, and as a result I'm getting a much more thin application. It's a bit more watery, makes it semi-transparent, and while that worked fine for the pre-existing trees in the background, we really don't want it for the ones in the foreground. So we are going to go over that again with another layer and just build it up a bit. Let's get you a little bit closer though. So we have two quite large ones here. And when they're really big, I don't like to start in the middle. I like to work on the edges first, because when we have fresh paint on our brush, that is when we have the best opportunity to render a very sharp marking. So I don't like to waste it in the middle of trees. I like to craft the more unique areas first, which is the edges. And then once I start to run out of pigment, then I'll head into the center. Because I am running out of pigment, I'll likely have to go back and do a second layer, but that's okay. And yet again, I'm working around and in between portions of our bridge. There's also another tree that's right behind this. I think I want to go in with a bit more of a softer blue for that one though. And we don't want just one big tree. We'll add in a second. Here I'm trying to get the edges, but because it's not that big, sometimes it is condensing, and that's okay. As long as we get a nice sharp edge. We're going to need to make these three-dimensional, but before we do, I'm going to take that liner brush, and much like the trees in the background, I'm going to start crafting individual branches, some big, some small. They can be slightly more semi-transparent because while these are in the foreground, we are still working with very small branches, which just aren't going to be that visible. And that's okay. So I'm just breaking these off in unique angles. Originality really is the key here. You will have some that are samey. That's okay. There are some in nature that are visually similar. But the goal is unique. Trying to paint from somewhat far away so that I have a good wide view. This one was a little risky, as you can see I almost doubled that application. Didn't mean to do that. Now I think I'll turn this into a tree in itself, just to avoid that looking too similar. And I think I'll have this one kind of wrap around and then back. See? We took something that was initially an unintended, not great look for the tree. One might call it a negative. And we turned it into a positive. We made it expand upon the painting in a unique way that we weren't going to otherwise. So try things. Don't be afraid to make applications. If you don't love them, you can turn them into something else, or fix them, or paint over them, or do one of 100 things, right? Because acrylics are just so malleable, quite easy to work with, quite forgiving. That's a real beauty of the medium. Try not to do too many branches on the inside, because I don't want it to get too visually complicated in the bright area. Using these almost as vignettes, as the eye will go to the brightest point of any piece, and as long as we keep this bright, the eye will go there. And then there was going to be another tree right here, but I want it to be more of that dark blue. So make a blue heavy mixture. It'll inherently be a bit brighter because of all of the blue. There we go. Could be a bit more desaturated. Started doing this one quickly and it got a little messy. This is a friendly reminder. Just because we've done a lot of trees doesn't mean we can get too loose with it. Still need to try. Still need to put in that effort. and it'll all work out. Now we'll get nice and close and render a slightly brighter, slightly more blue variant of the pigment we were just working with on the darker trees. Switch over to the liner brush or the smaller flat-headed brush, up to you. I'm going to aim for the flat-headed to begin with. And along the sides of our tree, we're going to tap on this highlight. It's a little bit of a tap and then a drag. And I'm doing this to create the implication of bark on the trees that are closest to us, texturally. But what it also does is it makes it look like light is wrapping around the tree, which will make it a bit more visually three-dimensional. And then I slowly work those highlights inside. This is very non-dramatic of a mix. We can, and we will, brighten it up just a little bit. Again, a bit more blue. We want that reflected blue light. Cool light working its way along the sides. The goal isn't really to expand the trees. I'm not trying to work outside of the edges much. I'm really just trying here to work over the layers that we've already made and make a portion of them a little bit brighter. Then I'm essentially doing this to both sides, but there will be an emphasis on the side that is facing the light. So if the majority of the light is here, then with these trees, the right-hand side of them is going to get more light, and I might add a little bit to the left-hand side. It'll be the opposite on the other side of the canvas. So here we might add it on this side. This will make these look a lot more cohesive, fit within the rest of the space well. This one's kind of in the middle, so we're definitely doing both sides. It's getting fairly watery, and that's okay too. Now this is a process that can really take some time, but I do want to show you right up close what this looks like as we build those highlights. Little taps, little drags, little work-ins. Trying to be a bit sporadic with it so that it continuously feels nice and unique. And once we start applying it to both sides of this one, it starts to make a bit more visual sense. As the pigment dries, it'll be a bit darker, which will also help just make it feel cohesive. We're definitely going over here as well. It's not as big of a tree, but those highlights still matter. Now we need to create a transition between all of the blue distant hues and what we have in the foreground here. So we'll do so by creating a green blue, starting with our sap green, about an equal mixture of our cerulean blue. We'll make it significantly darker and desaturated, so a lot of Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. We're looking for something fairly similar to what we have here, but we want a darker version that just has more green in it. And I think we're quite close to that. We'll do a little test along the side, and that looks great. So What I'm essentially going to do is move some of our trees back by placing this in front of bottom portions, so it looks like they're sitting in that area. But we're still going to make this quite a bit higher. I'm going in with a lot of taps with the top part of the brush. Still looking to be somewhat careful of the initial drawing, but again, we can just fix that up later. Love this brush because while it can move a lot of paint, while it can mix a lot of paint, it's also very easy to just get sharp markings, intentional markings. Now we'll build this up. These are just bushes in the background. We really need to push this area into the distance, and we do that quite easily, as you can see, by just working over the bottom portions of our tree. We have those little tabs to kind of signify the details. Not too tricky. There we are. Now we'll get a little bit closer. We'll brighten up our mixture. Not dramatically, but just a little bit. And then we'll switch over to our smaller liner brush. Make sure that's nice and damp. Grab our newly mixed pigment, and we can apply this highlight via taps to the tops of our newly applied bushes. We'll do these fairly spontaneous markings and have them slowly work downwards. This will just show that there is light hitting the tops of it, and then as we move down, we get less and less of that light because the subject itself will cast shadows on itself, and we'll just lose that. However, this is a good amount of very easy, subtle detail. Adds to the realism, adds some texture and some rhythm. So it's a great addition. Often the best additions are the subtle ones. So we don't want too bright, we don't want too saturated. We just want this to add a slight bit of dimension. Trying to leave randomized openings, trying to make some clusters a bit more dense. And of course, there are just less taps as you move towards the bottom, making it more sparse. This pigment actually, value-wise, works really well with the blue in the background. They're almost the same, so it's a really solid transition in a lot of different ways. There we go. Now we'll take a step back and we'll create more of a grassy area which works between the bushes here, down this way, and into what will essentially be this larger divot in the road. That way the bridge has purpose, right? We need an area here that kind of sinks in. So how do we do that? We start by grabbing our sap green, our Mars black. We still want it to be a cooler hue, so we use about a third cerulean blue to that of which we're using with our sap green. I'm mixing it right beside my past pigment, that way I know how dark I can make it. This is darker, but not substantially. So we'll apply this in between our pathway and the back there. And I'm going to make this work almost horizontally. We'll also apply it on the other side. Start to work it down. And then once we get to about the halfway point, we're going to make it darker. So additional Mars Black. We're going to add that here, and we're going to add that here. Might be a little dark, just a hint more green and titanium white. Then we'll aim for a subtle blend, but it'll essentially look like this area has a lot of shadow because it divots downwards. The bridge itself will cast a shadow upon it. Just mixing a brighter version to create more of a transition on the right hand side. We still do want that. Then we can build up our layers because our first layer will likely be something that we want slight adjustment in, or simply we'll just need more paint. There we go. You can see how it gets darker right under there. Obviously there isn't any texture yet. It all looks fairly flat, but that makes sense. Now I'm just going back and doing a second layer up here. Making sure this is nice and thick as well. We can even do little divots that go onto the road too. We can also place this pigment here in the foreground, should we want to. But we don't want a smooth blend between this right here and this. We want it to be a bit choppy so it looks like this actually exists in front. So there's a divot and it goes down and it comes back up, but we just see that top part, right? And that's what this is. There we go. And we'll just make that nice and thick. Now we'll get a little closer. We'll make a darker variant of our green. Perhaps something akin to what we have right here. Could be a little bit brighter, but realistically we don't want it much so. We want something for the shadows that the grass is going to cast on itself. I'm also spreading this quite wide on my palette. As you can see, interjecting a hint of blue. And then I'm switching over to my fan brush. It is dry. I want it dry because I want a lot of very tiny markings. Then I'm going to go back to our grass in the distance, and I'm going to apply a lot of vertical strokes. Give it little protrusions, but also bring these markings down into the rest of the grass. That way it's not just at the top, and we have these darker areas in there as well. This is also going to eliminate the hard horizontal line that we had. So here we are, a little bit closer. Go back in a number of these areas. And a lot of it is going to get lost, especially in the darker portions. That's okay though. That's expected. And it'll make it look nice and natural. But we do have this pattern to a point of grass in the back, which is definitely going to help build some realism. We're also going to use it at the front here, however, I'm going to do so initially with a liner brush and create individual intentional markings. A lot of them are essentially leaning this way and that way. We're kind of pointing the viewer's eye towards the center of the piece. A lot of these overlap. Some are darker than others, some are larger than others. Ideally though, they're quite thin. And we're grabbing an abundance of water on our brush to help us render that marking. But as you can see, it's quite quick. We're going to do quite a number of layers on top of this. So we don't have to worry about looking perfect. This is still an underlayer. It's still foundational. And we're going to cover the vast majority of it up. Said we can also still do a couple applications with a fan brush to get the additional extra sharp details in there, because remember, we are still just making markings with individual bristles with this, where with a liner brush, despite it being a small brush, it's still a large cluster of them. So we've painted the initial mid-value layer, we've added the detail and some depth with the darker layer, and now we're going to add a lighter layer on top where the light is coming down, it's catching the grass, and it builds additional dimension. So this needs to be brighter than the mid-value we had, which I believe is this pigment right here. So I'm going to mix right next to it. It is predominantly going to be a green mixture. However, I do still want a little bit of blue, especially in the back. And I think that's beautiful. It's worth noting that whatever we mix here, it will be a little bit darker when we actually apply it, because it will be semi-transparent and we will see the darker hues underneath. So I'll just spread this out well on my palette, pick up that fan brush. I did wash and dry it, so I don't have the older pigment, and I also have all of the bristles individualized visually. Now here we're going to go in and we're going to make as small markings as we possibly can, using next to no pressure. You are quite far away, so I'll move you closer. So here we are, grabbing more of that pigment. You can see that it protrudes past the darker portion that we've just applied. I'm not using the entirety of the brush, just about a third at a time, and I'm being selective with it. Sometimes you rotate the brush just for some added variance. And as I start to run out of pigment, I'll move down into the area that should dip and collect less light. Right? So at this point I have almost no paint left on my brush, and it's much darker, much softer. We can go back and we can build up areas to be more thick, create different clusters. That's looking nice. Needed the extra application, but the extra application did it. Very good. Now we'll head on over to the left-hand side, build up some additional highlights. I'm going to keep these predominantly to the left-hand side as we move down, and then as I start to run out of pigment, we'll work to the right-hand side under the bridge and below. And I'm starting to press a little bit harder to get just scrapes of pigment off my brush because there's very little left. Probably looks like there's quite a bit, but that is almost dry, which means I do need to clean my brush with water fairly soon, get that pigment off there before it hardens too much, but I don't want to do that too early either because I really want my bristles to be individualized. I don't want them condensing with the water. So, just trying to get as many sharp markings out of them as I currently can. I think that's quite good for now. So, from here, we do want to continue our grass. We want to do so in the foreground. It will be larger, and we can make it slightly less blue. So I'm essentially remixing what we were just working with. However, this time, I'll use about half the cerulean blue as I did before. There's still a hint of it, but it's very minuscule comparatively to what we have in the background. Then I'm going back to the fan brush. As you can tell, I did wash it and dry it, so I have all my individual bristles back. And with this, I'm going to create some taller grass. And it isn't actually taller than what we have in the background, however, it visually will be taller because perspective will just make it look larger than what we have back there, right? The closer subjects get, the bigger they look. Trying to create clusters. I have some openings, and intentionally so. We're also going to have a lot of leaves over this, so that's something to consider. We can also do a bit of that on this side, as we will have a piece of land that is larger there. I'm going to switch brushes to the liner, which almost dried with pigment on it. Currently saving that. Some days I'm much more attentive than I am others. And here we can be very intentional. Just grabbing some extra water. You can tell these markings are bigger. We're going to have them crisscross a little bit. Always a great way of making it feel more natural. We'll have some of that lean over onto the ground area. Very good. Now we have our first layer of highlight. Let's double down on that. Let's add some extra titanium white to our sap green mix. We don't want it to be too saturated, so we are still working in the Mars black, but we have now eliminated the blue from the mixture, and we have slightly brighter values in this mix of paint. Now to the liner brush, because I do want to be quite intentional with it. And here, I'm almost going to select just the tops of blades of grass and add highlight to them. I don't want to do this for the entirety of the grass. This is just the areas that really pop out, protrude, collect light. And I know you're quite far away, I know it's a detailed area, but it's one of those where you do want to almost do it from a bit of a distance. That way you make sure that the value isn't overwhelming, it's not too bright, you're not overdoing it. You want to look at it as a whole and not as a hyper detailed, individualized subject. There we go. You can see that I'm starting to hold my brush from farther away. That way I can get more distance between myself and the canvas. All of these markings are very watery, so I can go over them multiple times and really double, triple down on the areas that I love. And if I apply it to an area that I don't love, that's okay, because it's not going to be that bright because it is so watery. And I'll just not do the third, fourth, fifth layer on that area. Don't want to do too much of this at once, but I'll tell you what, I'll get you a little bit closer because you have been warned. We do know that we keep our distance for the most part, but I do want to show you some of the detail work. Now, this is grass that isn't taken care of, so it is taller. It does have a bit more of a messier, shaggy aesthetic to it. That's not a bad thing. I also like to do a couple at the very bottom that make it look like the grass goes beyond the canvas. I think that's quite important. And those strokes were a bit elongated in relation to others. Little taps even do a lot, especially in the negative space. Though we do want to keep some of the negative space because that contrast is what makes our subjects pop properly. Now, I am looking at this and I feel like I want openings in the grass so that it feels a little bit more natural. I want this, but partially in here. And the way of going about that is simply to grab that same raw umber, Mars black, titanium white, remix the basic hue that we used for this, and that looks quite close. We just need it a little bit less saturated. So we'll interject extra titanium white, Mars black, go in with another little test. And the best part about testing this pigment is that there are so many various brown hues in there that we can essentially place it anywhere and it'll turn out okay. So here, this is something you could have actually done prior to painting in all of the details of the grass or the grass at all. You could interject these, but I just realized I wanted some additional open space where this had a bit more of an area to bleed into. It'll also give us more flat ground to interject leaves, fallen leaves. So we'll just do a little bit of that. We'll switch on over to the liner brush, which is over here. And I'm going to do a simplified version of what I did on this, just because we don't need to make it look exactly the same. It's already in a very dense area detail-wise. There's a lot going on. We can make it look very similar by just tapping in some darker hues. and then mixing up a lighter variant as well. A little bit more gray. We're not going to have a lot of light in these areas though, because the grass itself will cast shadows. Right? We always need to think about the surrounding subjects, not just the subjects we're painting, but how they all impact one another. So here I'm not doing too much. Just little bits. And I'm doing this all rather keeping you quite far away, because it is one of those processes where it's much more important to see the larger scale than the up-close detail. We know what the up-close detail looks like. We've done that extensively there. So I like that. Wasn't a lot of work, but it made it more unique. Now we're going to grab this pigment. A lot of Mars Black, good amount of titanium white, mix up a darker variant that's somewhat saturated, and I'm going to use it to paint the tree that we have on the left-hand side. This would be a good initial darker mid value. As I work down, you can see that I'm not making an individual stroke like we talk about. Many strokes equates to a more unique, natural looking tree. And then we can fill in the middle section with the remaining pigment. Make it a bit darker, more Mars Black. We'll apply this specifically on the left-hand side of the tree. Let it blend into the center. Go with a titanium white. Work that into the raw umber. You can tap that on the right-hand side of it. Now you're far away. Again, that is purposeful. Then we'll do little taps inside. Let it slowly dissipate as you move towards the left-hand darker area. And from here, I will get you closer because the next area I do want to be a bit more detailed. From here, want to make a brighter version that isn't as desaturated, so the raw umber, titanium white, you can see this mixture doesn't have any Mars Black in it, and we'll switch to our smaller flat-headed brush, make it a little bit damp, not too damp, and I'll do that same technique of going onto the side, going in with those taps, a little bit of a drag, just delivering some light to the edge that will then wrap around. This is giving us texture for the implication of bark. Sometimes we'll combine markings and strokes, but we want it to look a little bit gritty. This is another subject where if we see that canvas tooth showing through, it's not a bad thing at all. Getting towards the bottom of the tree. We are going to cover portions of the bottom of the tree with additional grass and foliage and all of that. But if we paint these details here, then we have a lot more option as to how much of those other subjects we apply. Just want as much of it to look good in the base layers and the openings as we can. Okay, and as we move up, we're just going to do more of the same. Don't really have too much at the top here. So it's a quick process. Stepping back here, I like it. I have an idea. You don't have to do what I'm doing here. This is essentially what we see in the reference photo and what you see in the traceable. But I have a thought. I'm going to try it. I'd recommend watching before you go ahead and do the step, just in case it doesn't work out as well as I think it will, or I'd like it to. But we're back to the larger flathead. Raw umber, we're going for another really dark mixture, akin to what we have on the left-hand side. And I want to create a branch which works its way out of the tree. I feel like I have to be somewhat careful because I don't want it to follow the trajectory of the pre-existing trees. Otherwise it'll just get lost. Making it with lots of little markings. Let's make it larger. Don't want it to be too large though, because I don't want it to take up the entirety of the open background that we have of the pathway or overlap the soon-to-be bridge. This is kind of fun. Often you see me painting as I have my plan fully realized, and these are lessons, so I do like to think of a lot of the portions beforehand, kind of map out the 150 steps that make a painting like this. But here you can kind of see the deviation and just a little bit of problem solving in the moment. Not that there was a problem to begin with, I just felt like there was an opportunity. But when we go in without a plan, there will be problem solving. So here we'll break this off, make another little branch like that. And this is something that I don't want to extend too far. I don't want it to overlap with this, I don't think. But I think what we're doing right now will be a great conduit for small leaves. So we're just breaking these off. It's a leading line, it works us into the center of the painting. What we have to be careful about is not breaking up this into two halves. So I'm going to extend these branches somewhat dramatically. Bring this back so that they're all not leaning in a singular direction. This is more of a free-flowing subject. So don't worry about getting it perfect if you decide to add it as well. You know what? We're going to continue this over here. And I'm doing so because I think if I add foliage right here, I am breaking up this in half, and I want something to bring the foliage onto the other side. And not at the halfway point. So we're more 2/3 up or 1/3 down. And with that going as far as it is, then we can bring this over onto this tree, and the brighter leaf can kind of stand out in the silhouette. You're getting brave and bold with this one. That said, I like that. I do like it as a larger piece, let's get you closer and add some texture. So we start, of course, with a highlighted version of the brown. Still using a little bit of that Mars black, but for the most part, it is our umber, and it is our titanium white. Working this along the sides. I'll tap and drag. And I really like how this introduced more of the brown hue throughout the painting, rather than just having it here and here. Now I am starting to run out of pigment, so I'll start working this inwards. If we accidentally add too much highlight, that's okay. We can always just go in and take a darker pigment and work that over. Probably creates a nice blend and a better looking tree as a whole. Going to grab more of the highlight, apply that to the other side because it will wrap around the tree much like these. We're not trying to create an outline, but it does have somewhat of that effect. Now once we get to the smaller branches, we will need to switch our brush to the liner. Not sure if you can hear the train in the background, but always do love to hear those. Really reminds me of growing up. With the really small branches, we're not really going to be able to work on brown both sides all the time. So I might just add this on top. Though we're not trying to expand the branches, and that is something to be careful of. Okay. Very good. This actually turned out great. I'm really happy we were a bit more exploratory. And again, your tree doesn't have to look exactly like this. It really is just however it suits your painting best and the trees in the background, because we don't want our tree to go up and directly follow a tree, overlap a tree. I do a little bit with this one. If you can avoid that, do so. And then I try to find good areas for the leaves, which might be a little bit more open. So it's worked out pretty well. Just throw some extra details into this, bring it back into the rest of the tree, and like that, I think we're ready for the next step. Big fan of how that all turned out. It's time to add some moss to our tree, have it run up there a little bit. That way we connect our greens with our browns in the same way we did when we made that a little bit more patchy. And we'll do so by grabbing our sap green. We'll start with a darker mid value, not super saturated, not bright, very much akin to what we have here. We can apply this with this brush or with a smaller one, but I'm going to go in with a lot of vertical taps. I'm going to make some patchy areas. A lot of them are going to connect towards the bottom though. And the idea is essentially just that we have very unique edges on all sides. With a little speckles, additional areas later found in higher portions of the tree, but less dense, less large. Perfect. Now we'll make a brighter variant. Extra titanium white, a little bit of extra sap green, not too much. We don't want this to be too bright or too saturated because we don't want it taking away from everything else. It's just an additive piece. So there is extra titanium white and Mars black in comparison to something like the grass, for instance. And now we'll switch over to the dry fan brush. We'll just tap on some detail, some texture, running up the sides of our tree. And this is something I think I'll get you closer for. Up close, I think it's quite evident just how subtle our initial greens were. And in contrast, how these not hyper-saturated, not hyper-bright markings now pop because of it. We're working our fan brush for the most part vertically. Finding those little areas to splash highlight. Really like it when it runs along the edge of the tree as well. I think that's a good look. They can dissipate as we move inwards. You can do this with various greens, various values of them. Trying to get some areas that are more subtle than others. There we go. We can also add texture to the brown in the same way if we want to, but I think for now I'm quite happy with that. As we continue, I realize I want to take some elements of the blue on the top and interject it on the bottom. Still currently figuring that out, but while I do, I think we'll start doing the base layer for all of the wood that we have in our bridge. And I'll begin with about equal parts, our brown and Mars black, a hint of titanium white. You see a grand abundance of it right here. It's because more came out of the tube than I intended. That said, we'll try to make good use of it. With that, I'm going to head in with this brush. And I'm going to compartmentalize a little bit for the sake of organization. And by that I just mean I'm going to work on individual pieces. So here we're working on the floor of it, doing the edges first with the nice sharp edges, and then we'll paint in the body. Ideally, a lot of our strokes at the end are horizontal like this. That way if brush strokes show through, they're working in the same way that the boards would. Now these areas are a little small, so we're going to put this brush down, get you a bit closer, and fill that in. Now we're working with the smaller flat-headed brush, and we have an opportunity to get those extremely clean, sharp lines, like so. Trying to keep in mind the general design, keeping the legs somewhat still there. And I'll just try to straighten up the back here. It doesn't have to be perfect because the ground won't be perfect around it, but it's something we can work on. Now, using the same small brush, we're going to start painting in the rest of this. friendly reminder, if you've painted over it, you can go back to the start of the video to see where everything is placed. Or if you support the channel up over on Patreon, you can get the traceable for it there. So you can just put it back on the canvas nice and easy without worry of getting your proportions or perspective incorrect. Also, if you're new to the channel, Patreon is not only a great place to get the traceables, but I also post reference photos up there. We have all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which essentially teaches you the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into it. There are ebooks full of additional traceables. There are big bonus lesson series, some of which are done on 24 by 36 inch canvases, so we get to play with a lot of detail, really dive into realism. We also have an exclusive Facebook group that you can get access to up there, where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces and helps each other out. It's a really positive space for like-minded creatives. At the top tiers, I also occasionally do art critique videos. Actually working on one of those this week. That's fun. But it's a lot of value up there. Again, over 100 bonus lessons that you can't find here on YouTube, and some of them are pretty neat. We have cityscapes. We have different styles of painting sometimes. But I think the big attraction of that is the big paintings. The ones that take quite a bit longer, but are incredibly fulfilling. Really trying to be mindful of my markings here, trying to make them nice and straight. However, I have a camera right in front of the canvas, so I don't have the best angle to see or make markings. So I think this is one of those things where I'm going to paint the majority of it here with you, and then I'll just tidy it up when I can move the camera. I could move it back, but I think I'd still just be painting in front of the camera. There we are. And of course, fill in this bottom area. You can see just how thin the pigment is because my brush is quite wet. That is intentional. That is intentional. That way we get the sharp, definitive markings that we really want. Means we have to go back and do a second layer, but that's also okay. With that, I think, while we let that dry, we head on over to the other side and we start crafting this here. Okay, we're going to try a slightly different angle for the camera here, and hopefully find a good cadence of movement, solid perspective for you and I. On this angle, I'm finding it best and easy to work on the left-hand side of all of these posts. So that's what I'm focusing on. I can get a really sharp line. I know that if I tried to get the right-hand side of the posts right now, it would look a little bit more messy like this. So here I think the advice is to figure out where you're painting from, which lines are easiest to render in a sharp way in that position, and to do all of those. And then, once those are done, as these are, I'm going to move quite dramatically, and we'll try it from here. It's not as smooth as I'd like, but it's definitely more smooth than it would have been from the other angle. Painting almost behind the canvas right now. Head just stretched out around to the side. Oh, and the sun is coming out. I've had quite a few. It's really coming out. Let me fix that. Okay, yet again we are trying a new angle together. Working these strokes vertically. Multiple to avoid a larger curve. I'm going to extend the protrusion of wood here and fill that in. Just like so. Always get the edges first. We also still want to get this bottom board that protrudes. So we start with those edges, we fill in our space, and we do multiple layers because it's quite thin. That's okay. Do so here as well. We are also yet to paint the middle piece. My brush didn't have enough water there, and because of that you can see it's quite granular in the application. These are steps that I feel like take quite a bit of refinement. That's okay. Take your time. Get it to a place you really like it. There's no real rush. We're not trying to beat dry times or anything of that nature. Except maybe the abundance of titanium white that I accidentally have there, but again, that will happen here and there. And that's occasionally just the cost of making art. And that's okay. So I think what I'm going to do now is let this dry, probably take 5 minutes, and I'll just go back and do a second layer after that, make it nice and thick. I won't bore you with that process as we are really just essentially coloring within the lines, but there'll also be an opportunity to fix proportions and whatnot, just make things a little straighter. Now, stepping back, we have our next layer on there. It's nice and dry, but as you can tell, the darker values in this are far darker than everything else. So we have two options. One, make everything else darker. Two, we bring this back down to something that has a bit more noticeable hue in it, and therefore bring the value to a brighter place. That's what we're going to do, and we're going to start with a good amount of our brown, about a third of that in Mars Black, hint of titanium white, thank goodness, we do need to continue using that. And this should render a darker brown, but something that is still brighter than that which we already have. Switching back to the smaller flat-headed brush, and I'm actually going to begin on the base we have right here. Going to work my way in and around the more detailed portions, and then I'm going to work this out. I want the majority of it in the center. We want the majority of our light and our lighter applications in the center, because as we get closer to the sides, these protruding pieces can cast a little bit of a shadow, not a big one, but a little bit. Similar to the grass on both sides of this. And I'll get you a bit closer. Now it's time to continue building our highlights. So additional titanium white, additional brown, and that is quite bright. We don't want it to be there just yet. So we'll keep mixing in these pigments till we have a good stepping stone of a hue. and we'll just progressively make it a little bit brighter bit by bit. Placing this in the center. Pigment's much more akin to that which we have down here, which is nice. I'm going to try to leave a little bit of a dark lip right between the ground and that which I'm currently painting, because that will essentially give us the look of a board being here, right? And protruding. So I'm, again, predominantly putting this in the middle, having it get darker towards the sides. We're still fairly close to the middle right here. So we'll just blend that out. And then I go back in with a second layer because the first was semi-transparent, and by adding a second we can brighten it slightly. All of my markings are horizontal because I do want them, for the most part, directing in one way. I'm also, not sure if you can hear my back crack right there. Oh, turning 30 is interesting. I'm also going to start applying this pigment because I think this is a good first step to some of our boards. Like so. So this is the top area, it's going to get more light. This will get some good reflected light, but we're going to leave the area that faces the front a little bit darker, so again it's a little lip, much like we have here. So I'm getting the left hand side of these, but not all the way to the right hand side. And if you're worried that this looks a little too bright in comparison to what we have down here, don't worry. We're going to build up the bottom brightness so that this looks like it makes sense as well. It's a lot of going back and forth, but it'll get us to a much better painting. And then we can do a little bit here as well. Taking a step back, immediately I think we can see a real difference between this side and this side. Now again, the light is kind of all around with the exception of in front, so the areas that face front are going to be a little bit darker, again the lips for the most part, but the sides, on both sides, will be a bit brighter. So we can make this side brighter as well. Not dramatically so, but enough. And therefore the rules here are essentially that the left-hand side of all of the boards get the highlight, and the lip remains on the right-hand side. Being fairly careful as these areas are small. But we can always go back in and re-interject that darker hue a little bit later. So it's not the end of the world if you cover up slightly too much. Here I'm going to leave a lip, piece of the board that faces forward, maybe a little bit underneath. Then we're back to these more middle portions. Something we didn't do in here was brighten up that bottom board. You do it slightly, but I want to be careful. I don't want to use too much paint because I don't want to brighten it dramatically. And it can get darker as we progress down. So here we go, painting it at the top, letting the blend dissipate, and now we'll get closer again. So it's just getting better and better. Now let's make it brighter and brighter. More titanium white, more of our raw umber, hint of our Mars black, just a hint. And that's a beautiful pigment right there. Now we're going to test it, make sure that it's not brighter than what we have down here. Perfect, it's actually right in line with that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to apply it in the center, in the middle. We're going to let it dissipate. Then I'll take what's left and we'll just make some horizontal strokes. You can see there are these sharp little pieces. That's actually great. We love that. Makes it look like some texture in the boards. And I am trying to keep some streaks in here as well. Let it dissipate. Now I'll apply this to the brighter areas. You can see we're just slowly building things up, right? Using a very watery mix, so it's not too bright, and so that we get to see a lot of purposeful streaks in there, which will look like wooden texture. Trying to let this get darker as we work towards the bottom too. Do apologize if my hand occasionally moves in the way. This is just one of those subjects that is occasionally going to require those movements which are not advantageous for the camera. But I am trying to give you as much as I can in terms of a good view. So I'm just slowly building this all up, going back, doing more layers until we have the highlights that we really want. Stepping back, it's definitely starting to get that form, that structure, which is great, but in the process we've lost some of the darker lips, details, and we need to definitely interject a lot down into here. We're going to do so by going back to a much darker brown, Mars black, equal amount of our brown, hint of titanium white, and from here we'll switch to our liner brush. Now we're going to add a lot of detail into this in the form of lines which break up our boards. They don't need to be perfect. Some areas of the wood are going to be pressed together harder than others. So if we have openings in these applications, it'll actually look quite natural. We want those imperfections. That's also why we wanted brush strokes in our past markings, particularly horizontal ones. And you see that this is getting more and more subtle as I move backwards. That's because paint is running out, but it's also great and intentional because we want it to get smaller, softer. Here I'm going over previous areas with my fresh paint because I know it'll be darker and I want to use up some of it before we move right back here. we create those separating pieces. I'm also going to take this pigment and sharpen up some of the shadows that add real structure. This is again what I keep talking about when I'm mentioning lips. It's the areas of the boards that aren't receiving much light, so they have the shadow. It's a bit darker. There we are. At this point, I feel like we have a lot of the pieces in there, and I feel great about that, but it's time to start tying them together. And that means incorporating greens into this and blues down here. We're going to start by creating a moss for the second time. We did so on the tree here, and it only makes sense that said moss would also grow up and onto our bridge as well. So I'm going to be selective with this. We're going to add little spots here and there. We're going to try to get some unique applications and aesthetics. It's not going to cover the entirety of it, but there will be patches, and this will be a very organic way of moving one subject, one hue into another. Let me get you quite a bit closer though. So we're working with this darker green to begin with. It'll be our base, which we will build on. Ideally, the middle of these applications is quite dense, and then as we get towards the edges of them, they get more transparent, loose, have some spotty sections as well. The green also transitions really nicely into the pre-existing shadows that we have. So that's a good set of values to make use of. There we are. Now we'll mix a brighter variant. So additional titanium white in this one. Still some Mars black. You can see I'm mixing it into the previous selection of paint. And we're switching to our liner brush. We did the highlights on this tree with a fan brush. However, we did that because it's much closer to us, and we can see the details a lot better. These subjects are farther away, and therefore it'll be harder to see the details and the highlights of the moss. So instead, we're going in with a larger application via the liner brush. It's very subtle at this point, and that's how we want it. We're also going to avoid, for the most part, adding the greens into the more shadow intense areas, so we'll just leave the darker green on the bottom there, and any greens that are incorporated more so in the lips of the wood, we will avoid adding this highlight to those. Quite a natural tie-in. Stepping back, I think it's evident we need one more layer of highlight. So, yet again, more titanium white, more green, Mars black, but less of it. We are still applying with the liner brush. And that is perfect. I love that, actually. And you can see we're really trying to move it about. We can even interject this in areas that don't necessarily have noticeable green bases. As long as it's just a singular tap here or there, very tiny one. I think this is adding a good pop of color. There, yet again, you can hear my back. I tried a new back workout yesterday, released a new movement, and I don't know. Normally when you work out, it kind of stretches you out, but lots of cracks today. I wonder if we can do it again. No, okay. Seem to have worked through them. I don't know about you, but I actually really like stretching while I let paint dry. Just because you can find yourself in some awkward positions while doing so. And I feel like the energy just stays up more consistently if I'm being mindful of my body as a whole through the process. Not an everyone thing. I didn't have to do this when I was younger, but that's okay. We're finding ways to continue, and happily so. I think I'll also take this pigment and I'll create some strands of grass which catch real highlight. It's quite bright. Maybe too bright? Need to take a step back. I'm just doing enough that I can give it an accurate assessment. Really only doing the tops of pieces of grass that are really prominent. Okay, taking my steps back, and oh, that's great. Excellent. Love that. Really wasn't sure how it would turn out. And we can do slightly more, I would assume, just towards the opening here, which is receiving the abundance of light. Trying to have them crisscross here and there, as that does add an extra element of realism. And then have it dissipate as you move towards the left-hand side. Yes, okay, very good. Very good. Now, let's clean our smaller flat-headed brush because I want it for mixing but not with greens. So we're just going to dip that in water, wipe it off a couple of times, grab some cerulean blue, and we'll bring the blue that we have up there down. Means titanium white, Mars black, cerulean blue. Something a little bit more blue. We don't want it to be too bright. It can be more saturated in the background because it's closer to us. But here, I want to create little blue flowers. So that's a subject that will make sense down here. We can place them on different portions of our moss initially. And then we can find spots for them down here in the background. So little taps in the distance, typically in clusters. This will be a good subtle addition for the grass, which didn't have too much going on back here. into the background, it'll make more sense when we inevitably see them in the foreground as well. Alright? Let's go slightly brighter. Additional titanium white. And we have an option of just going in with a little tap, or we can make individual petals. I think I'm just going to tap on the implication flowers, make them really quite small. But I am doing the tap multiple times to build it up, make it nice and thick. We really don't want these to be semi-transparent. Love that as a detail. So easy, so quick, so impactful. There we are. Go over areas a couple of times, just build them up as need be. Being quite specific with my placement. There we go. Maybe we'll add a few bright ones to the distance. We're working over the past ones in the same way that we do moss and highlights. That should just about do it. Now we'll take a step back. Love that. I think it was a really strong addition, tying the top and the bottom of the painting together. But now, it's time to go back to the sap green with a larger flat-headed brush. Some of our Mars black, titanium white. Could be a hint of our cerulean blue, but not much. And we're mixing a darker green for our leaves. Now, I'm going to paint these initially with a fan brush. However, it has all these very sharp little bristles, and I want leaves that are much larger. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to dip my brush in some water, wipe off the excess, and immediately I now have a different kind of brush. You can see it's shaped like a fork. And this means I'll get 5 or 6 applications with every tap. Now this is essentially how a soft bristled fan brush typically works. This is a stiff bristled fan brush. It's a fairly unique one. It comes out of my brush set. It's the set we use for all of the acrylic lessons here on the channel, and if you'd like it, you can find it in the video description. But essentially when we painted earlier, we wanted the individual bristles for those very small sharp taps. Now we want larger markings and the ability to make them in a randomized fashion and a lot at once, and this is going to do that really well. So I'm going to grab that green and I'm going to start applying this towards the top right hand side. You can see how quickly we have an abundance of these markings, which is great, which is the goal. We'll start bringing that down a little bit. Create a bit of an opening. Let me start again. We can make the back part a bit more thick. And in doing so, add a vignette effect to the painting. Let's get you a bit closer. So now we're quite close up, grabbing additional pigment, sharpening some of those applications, building up that back portion. But we can also use it to expand and extend. That's also what I'm doing. We're essentially making up where the branches will be at this point. We can go back and re-interject branches later if we want, but it isn't really a concern because they might also just be small to the point where we don't really see them from this distance, right? We won't see everything naturally. We can just splash little bits down towards the bottom as well. Now I think we'll head over to the other side, get some balance in the painting going. These will go off towards the top. Always love seeing little leaves out in the open negative space. I think that's a great look. Rotating the brush to a point, but only in the air. Once the brush touches the canvas, it is essentially locked in because we don't want to rotate the brush with pigment on it on the canvas. That's how we get a bit of a smeared look. There we go. Now, stepping back, really do like what we have on the top left and top right in terms of our foliage. As you can see, I've drawn in some orange and yellow leaves on here. I did so using Conte, which is essentially like a colored chalk, great for drawing on canvas because we can take it off very easily by just adding a damp brush and working over it. But I definitely want to start interjecting more of a fall atmosphere to this, get some warmer hues in there. So I'm going to take the larger flat-headed brush, and over here on our palette we have a burnt sienna, a cadmium yellow deep hue, and a Naples yellow. Now I'm going to start with my Naples yellow at a hint of the cadmium yellow deep hue. I'm doing this so that I get something that's not as saturated as the cadmium yellow deep hue, but more saturated than the Naples yellow. And I'll also interject a hint of our burnt umber that'll warm it up, give it slightly more of an earthy look to it. We can thicken it by adding titanium white. That will desaturate the pigment, that will brighten the pigment. As you can see, it brings it closer to the Naples yellow yet again, but we can just continuously work back in the cad, yellow deep hue, and the burnt sienna until we end up with a hue we're very happy with. And I think all of these are actually quite beautiful. There hasn't been a mix yet that I have disliked. So this does lend itself to personal preference. But I do typically like to go with something slightly less saturated in the beginning and then build that up. With that, switching over to the liner brush. Alternatively, we could also use the smaller flat-headed, but I think this will be great. And I will get you a lot closer, but I thought we would just start right here so you could see the difference. Now with this, we don't want too much water on our brush, otherwise we're going to get extremely thin applications, but we don't want too little, otherwise we won't get sharp applications. So there's an in-between that we're constantly working towards. Because I have an orange mix, I'm starting with the orange leaves, and then we'll get into the more yellow ones after. There we go. Continuously grabbing new paint. You can see that I'm not trying to make a massive amount of these leaves with the same bit of paint. We're continuously going back and grabbing more. We can also add leaves that don't necessarily touch a branch because we can interject the branch later. Trying to make sure that each of these has a nice sharp top to it. Or end rather, because it isn't always at the top. Sometimes these will move out in directions like we're doing right here. And in that case, the body of the leaf is the most thick area, and the area that connects to the branch, along with the end of it, should be a bit sharper, a bit more tapered. Here you can see I'm working back in previous leaves and just building those up to be a bit more dense, a bit more opaque. Also creating new ones throughout as we expand. We can also throw the hints of them into the background through soft taps once we've almost completely run out of paint. But these are just taps. I'm not trying to get that same form, and I am trying to get a smaller marking in general. This is something we could do also with the fan brush, but I want additional control, and that's why we're doing so here with the liner. You can see the variance in application. Just like that. It'll make the leaves that we have here less stark, because there'll be competing oranges, but it'll make it feel more cohesive. So it's a trade, right? Now we are going to take that step back, start mixing up a more yellow mixture. So just less of the burnt sienna, but we still have some in there. We don't want it to be too saturated, so we do have to be careful with the cad yellow, but I think that's pretty beautiful. Going back to the liner. And there are a lot of these. I'd also like to note that I very purposefully made the leaves, for the most part, that are on this outstretched area yellow, and the ones that are a bit closer to the base and the left orange. And I did that because the yellow will pop. It'll be a bit brighter in value, and I wanted the eye to really follow towards the center of the painting. Now here we have a very dramatic cloud, made things significantly darker in the room. That's okay. We're not really trying to blend any difficult hues. So I'll just keep on painting these while our paint is nice and wet. And the cloud does not seem to be moving, so you know what? I will adjust the lighting. There we go. Now, if the cloud decides to move, we're going to have a very bright scene, but that's okay. Yeah, nice to paint in days where there are some clouds, because you get to see the painting in a setting which reflects that of a cloudy day and a sunny day. Maybe geographically you have more cloudy days, maybe you have more sunny days, maybe you want to paint for one of them specifically, but know what it'll look like in the other. And that can be a lucky turn of events. We're going to try to make these really nice and sharp. They're at the end of the branch. We're going to get some extra attention. I'm also not worried about fully covering up the initial drawing that I did with Conte, because we can just wash that off after. We're going to want to wait until all of our paint is fully dry, but it's quite easy. As per usual, we're taking those steps back, making sure that it all looks like it's coming together nicely. I do like it a lot. I think now that we've added the yellowish orange hints into the background there, we need to on the other side. So I'll just tap some subtleties into this with the liner brush. Not many. It'll show up predominantly over the bluish trees of the background just because they're a bit darker and it'll create that strong contrast. But the subtlety is really what we're looking for. So don't worry about hyper focusing on making it that noticeable, and I'm purposefully painting these from a strong distance so that you can see just how not noticeable as a whole they are for the most part. These are a bit more so. As we get lower, they will be more noticeable simply because we have a darker bottom and therefore greater contrast. But it's subtle. It's still relatively subtle. Now, once that's done, we're going to head into the bottom area and start putting some leaves on the ground. It doesn't just make sense that they're on the top, right? Always have falling leaves. So we'll go with a darker variant of our orange. So we'll use some Mars Black. We use a lot of our burnt sienna, good amount of our Naples yellow. This is a good earthy, darker brown. We can go with a couple variants of it, and I'll keep different wet variants on my palette throughout. That way I can be playful with my applications. And an area where these are definitely going to accumulate is towards the edges of our bridge. Just because there is a hard edge, and they'll get kind of pushed by wind up into those areas. So I'm starting off by just doing little taps on the sides, really not noticeable to begin with. We can grab slightly brighter pigments, work those more so into the middle. As we get closer to us, our markings need to get larger. Trying to space them out uniquely. Just like so. But now we're back to different oranges. And ideally the leaves are getting brighter as we move towards the center. It's a lot like the techniques that we used previously. I'll get you closer though. Again, darker pigment towards the edges. You can barely notice this one, but that's great. We love when that happens. That's a level of subtlety that is almost subconscious. Now, yet again, we seem to have lost some light. Just adjust that on the camera for you. There we are. Found a way of making it fairly easy to adjust. We've closed some blinds. The camera is close enough that I can just reach over and grab it. So we'll just adjust together. Like now, for instance. Again, when I started painting, when I started making these videos, I used to admittedly find it a little frustrating when the clouds would change the lighting that dramatically. But now I really do try to look at it as a positive. Seeing the painting in a different fashion. Right? Really trying to make these ones a bit more form heavy. It's not just a tap. There's movements within these leaves. There's larger bodies. We can also paint some in between the grass. We did create openings over here for a reason. And the oranges interjected with the blues is going to look great. Very subtle oranges. I'm almost apprehensive to call them oranges, just because they are so subtle. And more earth values than they are, more earthy hues than they are oranges. But orange is the intuitive color for it. Color and title. There we go. We can also paint some on top of the grass, but we have to be careful with that. It's not overbearing. So we won't do too many of those to begin with. And then we do need to tap them in the background. Can even line part of the grass a little bit, as the wind will push it all up against the grass and the bushes. And then as we run out of paint, we can work farther and farther into the background, because you want those semi-transparent markings there, where the blue will kind of work its way through. Orange and blue are complementary colors, so it'll likely desaturate itself, and that's great. That's what we want. Complementary colors, when blended together, typically do desaturate each other. So it, in these optical blends, should have that same effect. I'm just taking off extra pigment with my finger so that it's softer, it's more subtle. Not really trying to drag with my finger, I'm just lifting paint. Let's go for a more yellow dominant mix yet again. Let's build some highlight on just a couple leaves down here. Not all of them. We can do it on previously orange leaves or just create new ones. Choice is very much yours. I like to do a mix of both, because compositionally you'll find that you want highlights in different areas. However, adding it on top of a pre-existing leaf can add a lot of depth, because the bottom of the leaf can be a bit more orange and darker, the top can be brighter, and it'll just look like a nice blend of light working over the subject. Easy to do a lot of them. I'm going to try to be subtle with it. Now we'll go into more of an orange yet again. Again, looking for a lot of different hues. Occasionally creating little clusters. That's what I'm focusing on now, in the same way that we have some in the back here. Very good. And I think a really fun thing we can do is go up to the tops of some of these and apply leaves up here too, sometimes in clusters, sometimes individually. This will add some extra dimension to it. We want light and forms of it on this so that the eye has a reason to work its way upwards. The eye, as we know, will innately go to the brightest point in any piece. So by making these top areas a bit brighter, we effectively move the eye where we want it. Love that. I think that added so much to the painting. Now at this point, I am liking the mix a lot. I think we're definitely getting there. However, I think we need more leaves, and I think we need almost an abundance of them. So, a lot of yellow, good amount of the burnt umber. I am looking for a more orange mix here. Hint of our Naples yellow to desaturate and thicken. And then from here, I'm actually going to switch to the fan brush. I'm going to make it nice and damp so that we get that good fork effect. Lots of markings. And I'll create some natural clusters towards the bottom, as well as individual leaves and applications. Throw these into the background with very little pressure so that they're not too big. There we go. That makes me want more up here. I'm going to be a little bit bold and work some over top this tree and the green leaves that we have right behind it. This will kind of point inwards in a similar fashion to what this tree does. We can interject hints of it at the top and throughout. Definitely love that as an addition. I think we just need to go back and forth more with the oranges and the greens. We have a lot of blue in the painting, but I think the other colors balance it really well, make it a bit more unique, make it a bit more lively, and that's what we're really trying to accomplish at this point. Give it that life. So I think our next move will be rather dramatic as well. And again, feel free to watch me do all of the more dramatic applications before following along. In a lot of cases, these lessons are fully pre-planned, so you can just do exactly what I do as I do it. You don't have to pre-watch it. You can just go ahead and add the paint as I do. However, this one is a little bit different. We are being more playful. And again, I hope that just shows you a bit more my thought process. And that can be beneficial. Okay. Lots of leaves on the ground. We have good clusters. I'm going to apply this and then we are going to get a lot closer. So here we are, quite a bit closer. And the idea here is that if we add a darker green, the oranges will pop to a greater degree. So we're going to grab our sap green, our Mars black, a little bit of titanium white, and we're going to mix up not a hyper dark green, something definitely brighter than this, but one that is on the darker side. And then we'll make a second mix, which will be a lot brighter comparatively. Not a bright green, but if you look at these two together, dramatic difference, right? Now, the sun moved, so we're just going to adjust that for you. The sun moved, the clouds moved. We'll switch over to our smaller flat-headed brush. We'll grab some of our darker green mixture. I'm going to work this behind the tree that we currently have here and the leaves that I have. And again, this is, if you're watching the painting from the very beginning, this is something that you can do before we add the orange leaves. But I do think having more of a silhouette behind these will really improve the contrast, the pop, the internal value one receives from looking at the oranges. So we'll just move these from out here. This brush is great for rendering leaves, by the way, because we essentially get a very nice sharp end to it. And I'm going to cover up, this is where we get bold, a good portion of the bridge on the left-hand side here. I'll leave a little opening. This is a lot of almost freestyle painting, right? We're just adapting as we go, depending upon how our painting looks. Mine will likely look different than yours, at least my placement of these, because your trees will be in slightly different places, or this might be the highlighted leaves that you've added. Yes, we might all be working from a similar image and traceable, but there will still be variance, because we all have innate appreciations, and therefore we adapt to those appreciations. And this is further adapting, but the idea is that we keep slight openings of the blue shining through. The darker areas make the orange leaves pop to a greater degree, and I think it's doing a wonderful job of that. And there we go. One more stomp. There we go. We're just using this darker pigment to line the base, doing quite a few layers, making it nice and thick. Then we'll grab our brighter variant and we'll add some of that to the areas that protrude. So the ones that stick out the most, which catch the most light, that is where these come into play. So predominantly this pigment is used for the edges. It is blending into the darker pigment, so it's not super noticeable, but it will add some volume. Now, stepping back, I really love that addition. From there, we can layer some additional orange on top of it. So we're back to the burnt sienna, cad yellow, Naples yellow, and a hint of Mars black, because you can't have it too bright. The Mars black and the Naples yellow will desaturate each other, almost like a titanium white and Mars black, which is nice. And then we'll switch on over to our fan brush, make that damp, grab some pigment, and then this I do want to be a bit more randomized, so I am using this brush over the liner or the smaller flathead. And we're just building our clusters. You can see it stands out so much better with that dark backing. There we go. Try not to do too much at any given time. But I think it's working quite well. Now from here, yet again, we take those steps back. We continue to interject little bits of highlight in our leaves, just trying to create that variation and value and hue. Right now, using some titanium white, Naples yellow, cad yellow. I'm just trying to fill out areas that could use a bit more life. But I think for the most part, I'm actually really happy with this painting. I think that the orange, the yellows, they added the life that we needed. And by going in with a couple of different brushes, we were able to find that right balance. With that, towards the end of these lessons, I do like to give you a little code word. Something you can use in the comments to know that you are part on, in average, the 13% who makes it to the end of these videos. It's a little subtle badge of honor that I get to see and notice, and everybody else who gets to the end of the lessons, they also notice. It's always fun to see who can continuously get the keyword. And today we're going to go with a fall classic. I've used it in a fall lesson before, but I think we'll go with the word crisp, because we are doing with all of these crisp leaves on the ground. You can imagine walking through them and hearing that really perfect fall, again, sound. So you can use that as the comment. You can just say crisp in the comments, or you can turn it into a sentence. You can incorporate it, but yeah, always fun to see. With that, again, this is essentially the end of the lesson. So I would like to say a big thank you to all of you for being here. I'd like to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making lessons like this happen. I could not do it without your support. And again, if you're new to the channel, you can support the channel directly up over on Patreon. There's a link to it in the video description. But up there you can get the reference photos, the traceables, you can get bonus lessons, some of which on the big 24 by 36 inch canvases, all of my ebooks, art critiques, occasional little one-off videos, additional reference photos, all of my ebooks, Acrylics for Beginners, the ebooks full of other traceables. So there's a lot up there, including the exclusive Facebook group. Check it out if you're interested. And you can also find a link to the brush set which I used in the video description as well. So I think before I overdo it, this is where we're going to call it. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you just picked up a couple new ideas. I hope you feel inspired. I hope you feel ready to go ahead and create your rendition of a piece. And I hope that, again, we just kind of made each other smile here today. I do still want to do a couple more fall pieces this year. I also really want to do some seascapes. I have an idea for a cityscape. So I feel like fall is just one of those seasons where the ideas are always flowing. You just there's so many things to paint, and there just isn't time for all of them. So I'll try to figure that out, and I'll see you very soon with a new lesson. Thank you for being here. You take care, you be well, and above all, as always, stay creative.